The JFK files were released, but do we know what any of it means? Has the conclusion about JFK's assassination changed? It is time to really explore the significance of these materials and what perhaps we now know that we didn't know before. I'm going to be joined by two professors who are John F. Kennedy experts and have been analyzing this document release in depth. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. So it has been 2 days since the release of thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of documents about or connected to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in November of 1963, as per a directive from President Donald Trump. But what does it all mean, right? What's significant? Why were the records redacted in the first place only to be released now? And we are going to interview two great experts about this who did an analysis of this. And by the way, we did it almost like an emergency breakdown the other day. You can check it out, that Sidebar on Law&Crime's YouTube page, where we picked up some of the highlights from the National Archives release. And by the way, they collected those materials from other agencies, so it's fascinating to see all this. But again, without context, annotations, titles, order, it was very hard to make sense of it all. And there were some major highlights in the 63,000 pages, even though a lot of this information had already been released, but some of it had been released but was redacted. Now, a lot of it wasn't. So here's the question. What really happened before, during, and after November 22nd, 1963, when Kennedy was gunned down in Texas, with authorities saying it was Lee Harvey Oswald who opened fire on him? And there was a lot in this release. Included in the document release, for example, was information about Oswald's movements before the assassination, including a trip to Mexico, how he came back into the United States, whether or not he was a KGB agent. For example, you got this one document where a KGB official concluded, quote, Oswald was at no time an agent controlled by the KGB. From the description of Oswald in the files, he doubted that anyone could control Oswald, but noted that the KGB watched him closely and constantly while he was in the USSR. The file also reflected that Oswald was a poor shot when he tried target firing in the USSR, which was a little bit of an interesting detail. And there was also information about a former intelligence agent that worked with the CIA, Gary Underhill, who believed that the CIA was responsible for Kennedy's death. According to some papers that were part of this release, Underhill left Washington after the killing, confided in friends his theory that the CIA was behind this, and then he winds up dead a few months later from what was determined to be a self-inflicted gunshot wound. There was a lot of information about CIA activities and covert operations in other countries, including apparently using the cover of State Department employees. There was a document that apparently revealed Manuel Machado Losas, the treasurer of the Mexican Revolutionary Movement and someone who was regarded as a good friend of Fidel Castro, the Cuban leader, was apparently a CIA asset. Also, you have an interesting memo to President John F. Kennedy in 1961 that discusses CIA reorganization. It reads, one more CIA debacle will shake faith considerably in U.S. policy. The argument of this memorandum is that the CIA's trouble can be traced to the autonomy with which the agency has been permitted to operate. So again, what does all of this tell us? What does all of this mean? Got two great interviews for you. So first, we have an interview with Professor Larry Sabato, who is the director of the Center for Politics at the University of Virginia, also author of the Kennedy Half Century. Take a look. Professor, thank you so much for coming on. It's good to see you. Okay, the first thing I want to start with is, can you give us an explanation for what was redacted and what is not redacted? That's, I think, a big component of it, and why you see something that was redacted and is no longer redacted. I think let's start there.
Yes, essentially, from the very beginning, certain organizations in the government, particularly the CIA, more than anyone else, they have tried to hide critical parts of whatever documents remain in existence. Only a naive person would believe that we have all the documents or that they didn't destroy some along the way. In fact, we have clear evidence that they did destroy many documents in the 29 years they had between the assassination and when they were forced to turn them over after the passage of the JFK Act of 1992. And then they've had additional time as things have been batted back and forth. So they basically took out some legitimate things, Social Security numbers and tax information, which, by the way, they incorrectly have put back in, or at least the White House lawyers did. Yeah. But they also have taken out material that helps us understand the rest of the document, much less the crime itself. So this has been a difficult process. I'm sorry to say that despite President Trump's pledge that there would be no redactions, there are loads of redactions in these documents, and they just dumped more. We just got more documents, and apparently more coming tomorrow. So this is going to be something that is laborious. It is going to take weeks or months, and we can check back in next Christmas. And I'm not even exaggerating.
I'm sure. And I know that you and your team are, trying to go through these documents in an expedited fashion, but also in a careful fashion. So I'm going to ask you, from what has been reviewed so far by you and your team, what are your overall takeaways from the release? Is there anything that you learned that you didn't know beforehand?
Oh, yes. Quite a few things so far. We've got the majority of it still to go. What have we learned? Well, lots of extraneous facts that would be of interest to historians. But I think the most interesting parts are about how the CIA operated at the time. They were a power unto themselves, and their power was nearly unchecked. What also has impressed me in looking at the details is how individuals within the CIA, not the director, as much as the next layer of authority beneath him, people like James Angleton, whose name will be familiar to those who have studied this assassination, they basically directed and produced much of the background to the assassination and the follow-up to the assassination. The Warren Commission was never told most of what the CIA knew. In fact, almost nothing that the CIA knew. And I understand the need for CIA. I would never argue otherwise. I'm sure today's CIA is very different than the one then. But the one I see then and the one I followed over the decades, at least with respect to the Kennedy assassination, is an organization that has lied and lied and lied again. So it really makes it difficult to believe some of what you read, and you're not reading it all.
Does it change your conclusion? Does it change our conclusion about the assassination and who committed this crime?
Well, not yet, and I doubt it. I doubt it does. That's my instinct, and has always been my instinct. However, from the very beginning, when I first started writing about this and even thinking about it, and looking at all the possible individuals and organizations and countries that could have participated in the assassination, one by one, I eliminated them for various and sundry reasons, including the fact that it just made no sense for the Soviet Union to do it, or for LBJ to do it, which is a very popular theory out there. Who's left? The CIA, and they had plenty of motives. The truth is that President Kennedy did not like them, and they did not like him. Not the director, because eventually Kennedy got his own director.
Right.
But one thing I've learned about the CIA, they operate in silos and they operate at various levels and layers, and the director does not know a lot of what is happening. And that is intentional, at least intentional by the second and third administrative layers. So if anybody did this that wasn't Oswald, or if anybody encouraged Oswald to do it, or if any organization had a relationship with Oswald, it was no one but the CIA.
So, I mean, the big document that came out so far, and there's so many, but the big document that kind of connects to that is this document about Mr. Underhill, right? This idea that he came forward, said that the CIA was responsible. He winds up dead several months later. I mentioned him before. Is there something to that? Is there something to another document that you reviewed that would say, hey, listen, let's just take a step back. Let's look a little bit more about the CIA's alleged role or potential role in this? Is there something else that came out during the course of this release that is, furthering that theory?
Not in the documents that we have examined so far, but I have been told just in the past few hours by other researchers that there may well be documents later on. They've gotten a piece of some of those documents. Unfortunately, they still contain redactions. So it's possible that there are more things in there. I must say, though, in all honesty, there were many, many people coming forward with claims that so-and-so had done such and such, and that this person told me that, and I was in a car with Chinese diplomats, and the chauffeur asked them what was happening. There's so much of that you have to ask, what is the credibility of the individual? It is true that many of the individuals connected to the Kennedy assassination did end up dead, and some people have made a great deal out of that. Some of them were older. People get into accidents that have nothing to do with organizations trying to kill them. So I'm always skeptical of that, but I'm also open to it. I do believe that the CIA had its own methods and its own people in counterintelligence to carry this out without reaching to other individuals who might claim to have been involved. Can I give you one example?
Please.
This is important. The mafia was the number one theory for many, many years until we finally learned about the FBI wiretaps of all the senior mafia leaders. And they sometimes get on the phone together and they will chit chat with one another. And this won't be a shock to anybody who saw The Godfather, but they're braggarts. And if they had had anything to do with the Kennedy assassination when the subject arose, as it did, somebody would have said, well, I know more than I can tell you, or I don't want to say this, but we finally got revenge against RFK. There's none of that. In fact, they're asking each other, did you do it? I wondered if your people were involved in this. We've looked and we know nobody in our organization was involved. So I tend to think that we would have heard some claim of involvement from the mafia. So that was not permanently eliminated, but we put it to the side. Again, I just keep coming back to counterintelligence and CIA. They hated Kennedy. They were angry about the Bay of Pigs, even though they in the CIA were more responsible than anyone for the disaster, the debacle of the Bay of Pigs in April 1961, because they misled Kennedy about everything. And so Kennedy said more than once in private to his aides, I wish I could break that organization, the CIA, into 1,000 pieces. And he believed it. And I think there was a good chance after re-election that he would have reorganized the CIA, as Arthur Schlesinger, the aide to the president, who was the court historian for Kennedy and wrote 1,000 Days after the assassination, he had encouraged Kennedy to do, and others had too.
And we actually cited that before as one of the pieces of the documents that was in the release. Just going back to Oswald for a second, my perception is a lot about it was tracking him and what was his whereabouts. Did you get a sense from the release, and this might have already been, you knew this before the release, but was there something about the release where you saw a potential failure in tracking him, how he was brought back into the United States? Was there an issue in surveilling him? Talk to us about that.
Sure. There are lots of pieces to this. The question that I'm always asked is, how did this defector, and there were just a handful of Americans who defected to, the people's paradise. And it's difficult to even imagine somebody wanting to live there because of the scarcity of goods and food and that kind of thing. But he did it. And you would think that the CIA, with all the personnel they had, I don't know how they ever got enough money to do everything they did. You'd think they would have carefully tracked the defectors. And you would think it should have been difficult for a defector, unless he was a double agent, to get back into the USA. And yet Oswald was able to do it, even though he had been sent to Minsk to work in an obscure television factory. It was approved. And by accident, a colleague of mine had talked to the consular individual in Moscow who had approved Oswald's request to go back in. He had been told to do it by a higher up. And the higher up said, we've tracked him enough and we've got enough information on him to know that he's worthless. And Oswald was a very failed human being in almost every way you could fail. He did not look like someone who could have put together a 3-car funeral, much less assassinated a president. But think about that. If only they hadn't signed that form, Lee Harvey Oswald would not have been back in the United States. But it goes way beyond that. It's the fact that the CIA tracked Oswald closely. That's one of the things they have lied about most frequently for decades. They knew a great deal about where Oswald was and what he was doing, and they were opening his mail. They knew where he was. And the FBI was following Oswald and making him report to them, or having one of their agents go to his home to interview him on a regular basis. Oswald even came into the FBI office shortly before the assassination and told them to leave his wife alone, and if they didn't, he was going to come back and blow up the FBI building. And the supervisor said, the guy's just a nut. Don't worry about him. In our age, we know if somebody threatens to blow up an FBI building or anything else, we should pay close attention. But they didn't. They also knew where he was working. If only the FBI had told the Secret Service that this very deranged individual who had been a defector to the Soviet Union worked in the Texas School Book Depository on the route of the limousine for Kennedy's visit, or if the CIA had informed the local police in some fashion or another. In those days, as you know, local police frequently picked up troublemakers before a VIP came to town and put them in the tank for a day or two. Oswald wouldn't even have been at his workplace, much less had a gun to shoot Kennedy. I'm just giving you the surface.
Yeah. Of course.
So many things. You shake your head because this never should have happened, which is what causes people to think and to say there must be something more behind this. There's too much incompetence here.
And look, we could spend 3 hours talking about everything here with Oswald.
3 weeks. 3 months.
Yeah, Oswald, Ruby, MLK. I wanted to ask you this, though. Just as we can try to conclude the interview, were there any particular documents that were released that stand out to you? Anything that surprised you in particular?
Well, actually, many. I'm going to cite one because I think it's relevant to the Kennedy assassination. We knew that the CIA, or we've known for years, that the CIA was opening mail, which, by the way, is against the law. It's called mail tampering. But they were above the law. They were the law. They had 200 to 300 full-time employees in New York just examining the 500,000 letters and packages that came from the USSR to the U.S. each month and from the U.S. to the USSR. 200,000 of them got some additional scrutiny, and about 1,200 a month were set aside for intensive scrutiny. Guess which years this operated? From the 1950s through the 1960s. When was Oswald in Moscow? 3 of those years in the late 1950s and the early 1960s. You're going to tell me that they didn't open up the letters from Oswald to his friends and to his mother? Of course they did. That was part of their tracking of him. So, as I say, they have never told the full truth. They didn't preserve records of what they did. You can't tell which individuals they had surveilled because of what they had opened up in that New York bureau. Just so many things we don't know. And of course, all these people are dead. And I think that was the original intention. Just stretch it out as lawyers do until the principals are no longer available to be put on the witness stand.
Well, look, as you said, this is kind of the beginning point. I'm curious to see where it goes because more documents get digitized, and maybe there'll also be an annotation system where we can easily see what everything is. But listen, Professor Sabato,
Good luck.
Yeah,
with that.
I know. I think they're going to have a separate
coming out tomorrow. More coming out tomorrow.
Okay,
so there's enough here for months and months and months. Believe me.
Okay, well, stay in touch. Would love to have you back on to talk about it, Professor Sabato. Thank you so much for taking the time. Appreciate it.
Enjoyed the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, now we have an interview with Professor David Barrett, a professor of political science at Villanova University who studies the Kennedy presidency. Professor, thanks so much for coming on. Great to see you.
Thank you.
Okay, so you told CBS News non-scholars who dive into these documents are going to be baffled as to what most of them have to do with the Kennedy or other assassinations. So I ask you, what do these documents have to do with Kennedy or the assassinations or whatnot? And I understand that you haven't gone through all, 63,000 pages. You're not an AI chatbot, but I know you've been going through hundreds of them. So that's the question I asked you.
Well, it goes back to 1992 when Congress passed a law following, you remember there was that movie JFK by Oliver Stone, which was a very dramatic, in some ways impressive movie, although I sort of regarded it as fiction. But anyway, there was a kind of a public uproar. And so Congress, and it was the first President Bush acted, they passed this law called the JFK Assassination Records Act. And it was decided way back then to, and I think this was smart, define the Kennedy assassination plots, if there were any, to sort of define that topic broadly, to include covert actions against other countries where there where definitely was or might have been some kind of assassination plot. Therefore, we end up in this release of documents, we get documents about Vietnam, Indonesia, 1 or 2 countries in Africa. So that's why, although I will say sometimes I'll see a document, and I've been to probably 25 archives in person in my career, and these days one does a lot of research online, but the archives and what they have, it's not that completely well organized. So random things just kind of show up.
What are the details that you now know that you didn't have before? Because a big part of this is there were things that were redacted and now are not redacted.
Right. To my knowledge, what I've seen so far are documents that were sometimes lightly, sometimes very heavily redacted, and now they're not. Occasionally, I've seen one or two documents that might still be slightly redacted. I'll tell you, for anyone who's interested in sort of operational details of what CIA was doing in the Kennedy era and a bit before and a bit after, and even names of people, like names of foreign individuals and Americans, including American businesses and newspapers that were cooperating with CIA. If you want to know about those things, it is there. And things like last night I came across a document that indicated that the main informant for CIA in Mexico in a certain time frame, which would be sort of mid to late 70s, I guess, was the president of Mexico. I mean, usually it's not that sort of a high level of an informant. I do see information about people who may have interacted with Lee Harvey Oswald or Jack Ruby. And it's hard to know what to make of these. And I think, FBI and others struggled sometimes, like, is this person reliable or not? But, some of those things are there. And it may well be that an assassination specialist may find there's some nugget of information that explains something. And others might not understand that nugget. I've written about CIA in the Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, a little bit Johnson era in some publications. And sometimes in my research, I'll see a document and I think, well, yeah, I'm going to keep this printed, put it in my files. And it's only later when I read it in context that I realize this is really useful information.
A big part of this, and I know you focus on Kennedy more generally and separate apart from the assassination, but the relationship between JFK and the CIA is so important in understanding. I was reading this, I was trying to get a sense of what is that relationship. Okay. And, I talked about it before, there was at least one document where somebody had sent him a memo regarding perhaps reorganizing or restructuring the CIA. What from this document release, what can you tell us? What did you learn about Kennedy's relationship with the CIA?
It's going to sound like I'm bragging. I've been thinking about that question, that topic that you just raised, for years. So I sort of feel like I've known about it, and what I'm seeing in these documents reinforces it. Kennedy, after Bay of Pigs, after the failure of Bay of Pigs, he was just furious at CIA because people like Allen Dulles, the leader, had sort of urged him onward toward this, and they could have given him better, more thorough information. So he knew that. He was angry. He was furious at the Joint Chiefs of Staff because they had more or less endorsed the operation, furious at the State Department for leaking after the effect, saying, oh, well, we didn't favor it. And he was furious at himself, where he said, how could I have been so stupid? So he learned to develop ways of gathering better information, and he let it be known to Allen Dulles that Dulles would be leaving. I mean, he did it in kind of a nice, civilized way, didn't just fire him that day. And he hired someone who was a Republican Cold Warrior type named John McCone, who was very capable. I'm going to disagree with some other scholars who focus only on Kennedy and CIA. I've looked at Kennedy and bureaucracies, and I can tell you, it's true of Kennedy, it's true of other presidents. They generally don't like and don't trust the bureaucracies of the executive branch. They're not responsive enough. They're not thinking about the president's agenda. They're not thinking about the president's political situation. And so they tend to be distrustful. So that was true of Kennedy in a general sense towards CIA. But, there's this quote that shows up everywhere that says, where Kennedy allegedly said, I want to shatter the CIA into 1,000 pieces. I mean, that just shows up in so many publications, not this week, but for a long term. And I don't know that he'd ever said that because that quote first showed up, years later from someone speaking off the record. But he did not automatically, after Bay of Pigs, he certainly did not automatically believe things. But I want to say this also. He developed a very high respect for some of the things that CIA could do. So, for example, they created this thing that's now called the President's Daily Brief. It had a different name, but that tradition of giving the president a daily kind of a newsletter about what's going on in the world. I mean, he read that thing. And if he had questions about it, those questions were then sent to CIA to explain further. So he relied on that.
Are those documents have you seen those documents in the release, those memos to the president? Daily briefing?
Most of those have been partially or fully declassified. To me, it's silly that why weren't they fully declassified long ago? But what I specifically saw night before last, where it was called the President's Intelligence Checklist, PICL, PICL. And I saw the ones that had still been kept mostly classified for goodness knows what reason, from a few days before the assassination to a few days after the assassination. But, the bureaucracy, certainly including CIA, have been so heavy-handed at keeping things classified, even after that law was passed in the 90s. When you read, what Kennedy was seeing the couple of days before the assassination, what Johnson saw a few days after, you think, why was this only declassified day before yesterday?
Well, why, that's a good question, right? I mean, what is the best
I think I have an answer, but
what's the best guess you have in terms of why it was redacted for so long and why it was non-redacted now?
Yes. When the CIA was created in 1947, there was a law, the National Security Act, and it directed the director of Central Intelligence to see to it that information regarding sources and methods, I'm sure you've heard that phrase, sources and methods, that information about how U.S. intelligence, specifically CIA, did its work, sources and methods, be kept secret. So on that basis, the CIA kept its operations secret for years, decades, except maybe telling a few people in Congress, and certainly the president and a few others. But across the years, they just became so used to doing that they, and I don't know who the they was, because sometimes when I look at documents from the Kennedy era that I've looked at, not this release because there seem to be almost no redactions, but you see maybe the first page and then 10 pages are still kept classified. And I think, well, that's insane. But they developed this practice of if anything seemed to reveal anything about sources and methods, they would just block it out. And so the whole declassification process is screwy and complicated, but I think I've sort of figured it out as a consumer. The same document, believe it or not, can be, quote, declassified at different points along the way. Once in the 70s, once in the 80s and the 90s, and you can see what different people thought should be kept secret. And when you see some of the things they did keep secret in a prior release, you think, that's absurd. Like I saw one that said it was blocked out that the CIA carried out signals intelligence gathering with regard to Cuba. Well, of course we did. We have a thing called NSA, National Security Agency. That's what they do.
I guess the question is, somebody would say, did they redact it because they were trying to cover up something that happened with JFK? That's the main question. Now, from what you're saying is, no.
I don't think so. I don't think so. First of all, look, most people who work at the agency and have worked it there in recent decades, they don't really care that much, most of them, about this history. They're doing their present day jobs and they're not thinking about history. Now, I'm thinking about history. I think it's fascinating. I think the subject matter, very interesting. But, they're doing their jobs. Now, I know they have what you could call a history office, but those people actually don't make the decisions about what gets declassified. I think at the time of these events in the 60s, a couple of points. First of all, a lot of things were never committed to paper. That's number one. A president could give a wink or a nod or a grunt and indicate approval, and that may or may not have made it onto any piece of paper. These days, that's not true. When a president authorizes covert action these days, there has to be a piece of paper that the president signs. The other thing is documents. A lot of documents were destroyed way back when. I mean, I know that. I've seen documents that say, well, these number of documents were destroyed without any real explanation of why. So there's that. So no wonder people are suspicious. But I don't see the evidence that was cover up in recent decades because of what happened long ago, because of embarrassment.
From what you've reviewed so far this week, are there any documents that suggest to you JFK was a threat to the CIA in any way?
Only in the sense, it turns out, he wasn't a big fan of either his CIA directors. He appointed Allen Dulles, who was a holdover from the Eisenhower administration. He liked him, respected him, but he came to think he just wasn't doing a very good job. So he hired a very capable, energetic man named John McCone, this Republican Cold Warrior that I referred to. And then he came to realize, oh my God, he is so annoying and he's not loyal to me. He refers, not in this release, but on a tape recording, he says, that John McCone, he is such a he's stupid, he's a So, I think McCone understood he was not the president's favorite. So in a sort of a general sense, they knew that the president could reduce their importance or their role, but not in the way that it's often described in the popular literature, which just says, oh, Kennedy hated the CIA and he really wanted to destroy it. If I can go back to that memo you referred to, reorganization, I can see in the news media currently treatment given to it that really exaggerates its importance. That memo was from Arthur Schlesinger. a speechwriter, a historian. And Kennedy liked Schlesinger. He had him on the staff, although Schlesinger's office was not in the West Wing. It's over in the East Wing by the First Lady's offices. He regarded Schlesinger as something of a friend, but really a kind of a second-tier advisor. Schlesinger advised a reorganization of CIA and a reduction of its covert action and human intelligence role, placing all these CIA officers in embassies abroad. Kennedy didn't follow the advice. So the importance of that memo, I see some people saying, it's very reflective of Kennedy's attitude toward the CIA. No, it's not. It's very reflective of Arthur Schlesinger's view of the CIA. Kennedy did not follow his advice. He did not reorganize the CIA, and he hired this John McCone, Republican Cold Warrior, to be the next director, and Schlesinger was very disappointed in that.
One of the things I find really interesting is Cuba and Fidel Castro, and I don't know the history clearly as well as you do, but one of the things that stood out to me, one of the documents, was it seemed that Castro was upset that Kennedy was assassinated and kind of in this uncertain place about what would the Johnson administration look like. And you're getting a lot, at least for me, I get a lot more sense of what that time looked like, and CIA efforts to maybe undermine or overthrow Castro, and also this idea, because I know there a lot have been theories about what happened with JFK. What did you take away from that in terms of Castro's, the education regarding Castro in this document release?
In one sense, of course, they were rivals, enemy, Kennedy and Castro and all that. And, Operation Mongoose was all about, not necessarily in some ways about trying to kill Castro, but it was really about Kennedy wanted to overthrow that government, overthrow that regime. But my sense of it is that each of them recognized that the other was a charismatic major player. They were both relatively young. I think there was a certain mutual regard for each other, but it did not, I'm not going to say that they really ever expressed it in their lifetimes, but you do see it with Castro. And I saw yet another document last night. It was someone who had spoken to Castro. CIA had an agent there, someone who had talked to Castro and passed it on. And Castro did say that this is very, very sad. And I think there was also a nervousness about what Johnson would be. They thought he's this gunslinging Texan. So I think there was a certain regard that Castro had for Kennedy, although, look, he knew Kennedy was trying to overthrow him, and he believed correctly, that, frankly, the U.S. government had tried to kill him. I think he could not know, and we're not still entirely sure, if Kennedy knew details of these plots to kill Castro, or if he authorized them. I mean, that's something I would love to find in this release, is actually some kind of, smoking gun evidence that Kennedy knew of and authorized plots to kill Castro. I'm not optimistic about finding it, because that fits in the category, I would say, of things not put down on paper.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm glad, because people would say, 63,000 pages, maybe more. All the answers will be there, but maybe they won't be. Let me ask you this.
Some answers.
That's what I want to know. From what you've looked at, from what you've reviewed, to be a little more specific, is there any particular set of documents that stand out to you? Anything that seems strange? Anything that you think is noteworthy for the audience to know? I know it's more of a broad question, but
no, I'm just sort of smiling as I think. Yeah. Because I've seen. I'll say this release, what can I say? I'm not a fan of President Trump, but this release of documents, since I'm actually working on a book on Kennedy and the CIA, it's like a gift to me, because suddenly we can see things and read things that we couldn't before. So here's something this is an example of why it's in there. It wouldn't be obvious. What does this have to do with the assassination? But I saw some things about Mexico, and I don't know the extent to which researchers had full documentation on it. So it's just clear from the other document that the Mexican government, Mexican intelligence, had penetrated the Cuban embassy in Mexico. So they had, apparently from this document, I saw very good information about what the Cubans were saying to each other in the embassy in Mexico City, because Oswald spent time, as we all know, in Mexico. So that's relevant. The other thing that I came across, it's just startling to see this, because before it was obviously redacted, there was a document that indicated that the sort of chief intelligence source in Mexico, back in that sort of era of the 60s, it didn't name the exact years, the CIA's chief source of information, and I suspect they gave him money, but it doesn't say that, was the president of Mexico. So, I think before Oswald and after the assassination, before and after, there really was this intense intelligence relationship between the U.S., the CIA, and the Mexican government and Mexican intelligence. And in a general sense, I would say we knew that. But to see in writing this statement about the president of Mexico, and the document, ironically, is a document recording that a high CIA official is saying it was the Church Committee in the mid-'70s that investigated CIA, what it had done in prior years. And this CIA leader saying to them, look, I'm telling you, the president of Mexico, like he was in that time frame, or maybe it was this man, it was Echeverria, I may not pronounce the name right, but he was our chief source of intelligence, and he's now the president of Mexico. We cannot have that get out. So it is startling to see that. Can I tell you about what I regard as a very amusing document that I found?
Sure, please.
And you wonder kind of why it's in there, but it relates, I believe, to Indonesia, where we had tried to overthrow the leader in this time frame. It's a document that, and it was heavily redacted before, and now it's not redacted at all. And it indicates, now this is just before the Kennedy presidency. This is actually 59, late Eisenhower period. So a foreign leader was going to visit the U.S. He was going to spend time in Los Angeles, and then was going to spend time in New York. And the document indicated, he basically told someone in either State Department or CIA, I want you to provide me some women. He had a voracious sexual appetite. And so that's not really State Department kind of dirty business or unsavory business. That's more in CIA's line of work. So they used what you'd call a cutout. They went through a couple of people. So this man who was a Hollywood lawyer arranged to hold a party, invited this one particular actress, unnamed. It says part-time actress, so I don't think she was famous. I don't know. She's not named in the original document. And she and the foreign leader hit it off. And then she spent 3 nights with him. And she sort of fell for him. She thought he was very charming. She liked him. He liked her. And he asked the person who was arranging these things on behalf of CIA if they would send her out to New York, where she could spend 4 days and nights there so he could see her every night, which they did do. I'm pretty sure it was the leader of Indonesia. He's not named, but I checked. First, I thought April 1959. Castro was here that month, and he was, but the dates didn't match up. But Sukarno was his name. He's no longer alive. He was overthrown in a coup some years later himself. But he was in L.A., and he was in New York, so I think that's who it was. But to see a document unredacted about it is pretty fascinating and amusing to me.
I think it's incredibly fascinating, and I know you're going to continue analyzing it as it comes through. Please, we have an open channel, open door. Would love to continue the conversation as you learn more and analyze more. I believe I've heard experts say it might take months or years to fully process and understand what all this means in the large context. So definitely would like to continue it. Professor David Barrett, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks. My pleasure. Great being here.
All right. So do we have more clear answers about what happened with JFK before, during, and after? Maybe. We'll continue to follow. We'll continue to see what happens. Again, I think that this is going to be analyzed and studied for months and years to come, but hopefully we get a chance to do a little bit more here on Sidebar. That's all we have for you right now here on the show, though, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. Speak to you next time.